At this point, I don't think it's a stretch to say that the way a game is presented and the impression the player gets from that can at times play just as big of a part of the overall experience as the core gameplay. In fact, right now, you could probably list 5 to 10 examples where a game's presentation pretty much carries the mechanics. On a side note, as someone who had very limited exposure to late 90s console gaming growing up, PC racing games for my whole life as a kid, I now find myself randomly obsessed over the eras of the industry that I missed out on, and even in the genres I'm not really that into. One of those genres being puzzle games. See, direct action was always more my forte, especially when high speed is involved, but you already know that. Despite this, I had always been aware of the cultural relevance of Tetris, but what I didn't know was that it wasn't just one game on the NES and Game Boy, but rather a whole franchise spanning nearly every console generation known to man. All of that leads me to what I want to talk about for the next couple of minutes, that being my 3 favorite Tetris installments / spin-offs on the N64, and why despite my general lack of interest in the puzzle genre as a whole, these games keep me coming back. I just want to make it clear that this will not be a formal critical analysis of these games, but rather, as the title suggests, I want to talk about the aspects of their presentation that gives them their distinct stylistic identity. With that said though, I still feel I should bring you up to speed on at least the core mechanics to anyone unfamiliar, since 2 of the 3 games here aren't quite your usual Tetris experience. The latest of the trio, released in '99 and developed by H2O Entertainment, the new Tetris is the opposite of what I just said. It's just your standard Tetris, and I think I'm right in assuming everyone watching this is familiar with the gameplay. It might come off as a bit of a surprise to some, but this game actually marks the first appearance of mechanics that will go on to be staples of the franchise, holding pieces for later use, and that transparent outline of your piece to help with aiming. Going back 2 years, but sticking with the same devs, Tetrisphere is where it gets a little weird. This right here is more of an action puzzler, and its core can best be described as first-person Tetris that's a hell of a lot more fun than Weltris. Your job is to revolve around the sphere and drop one of 2 pieces so that you create matches, ultimately digging your way to the center to free this little googly-eyed dude inside. Every now and then, you're given a piece that will take the shape of whatever you place it on top of, and by far the most different mechanic from standard Tetris is the ability to move pieces around, with the highlighted ones letting you slide them on top of others. After destroying enough of the sphere, you gain access to a couple of screen nuke type moves that clear out a bunch of pieces in one go, like a stick of dynamite or a bottle rocket. Out of the 3 games this video focuses on, Tetrisphere is easily the most fast-paced and, big surprise, my personal favorite as far as the core gameplay is concerned. There's more of an emphasis on quick action rather than meticulous strategic thinking, and there's just nothing quite as satisfying as ripping through match after match until there's just one layer of the sphere left. Even if you don't care for its presentation, which is what this video is ultimately about, I still highly recommend you try it out. I made sure to save the most convoluted one for last. This right here is Wetrix by Z2, released in '98, and it might just be the most one-of-a-kind puzzle game that I've ever played. Your goal here isn't to stack or match tree of anything, but rather to create pools of water that can then be evaporated by dropping fireballs on them, whilst having to safely dispose of nukes and avoid causing earthquakes. The gameplay isn't as insane as it sounds. Your 2 main tools are uppers and downers, which morph the playing field accordingly. You use these 2 to create space for the falling clumps of water to settle into, as spilling too much of it ends the game. You're going to want to keep at least a small portion of the stage dry, since you're occasionally given nukes that absolutely have to be detonated, and don't think about cheesing it by throwing them off the stage, because the devs are one step ahead. The destructive forces you're actually going to want to use on the water are the aforementioned fireballs, which evaporate any water they fall into, which is how you build up your score. You might have noticed the earthquake meter to the left. That thing forces you to use your downers and nukes, since the more terrain you've amassed on your platform, the closer you get to having to deal with most of it getting destroyed, which, depending on how much water you've got waiting to be cashed in, might just end up being a game over. I know it sounds like Wetrix is incredibly punishing, and it actually kind of is, especially outside of practice mode, but I'd still recommend it if you're looking for a real mindfuck type puzzler with way more depth than I'm letting on to. Keep in mind that I'm in no way actually that good at this game, or regular Tetris for that matter, so there's definitely tons more subtleties I'm missing out on. Not to mention I haven't even touched upon the ice and duck multipliers, but again, that's not what this video is really about. Speaking of which, now that I've got you up to speed on the core gameplay of the more obscure of the N64 trio, we can actually get to the meat of the video and the reason I'm doing it in the first place. I like to think that I'm far from what you'd call a graphics whore. I couldn't care less about texture resolution, general output resolution for that matter, shadow map sizes, etc. But I cannot overstate how important a game's aesthetics are to my overall enjoyment of it. That, along with their sound design, is what drew me into these trees in the first place. Wetrix is, ironically, the simplest in terms of its visual presentation, but that simplicity is justified as this game sports some of the best 5th generation water simulation you can find on the system. The way it ripples when other game objects interact with it and distributes itself across the playing field is just pure eye candy, while also being an integral part of the gameplay loop. Aside from the gorgeous water, the backgrounds have this pure vaporwave color palette and fogginess which contrasts nicely with the minimalist checkerboard texture on the main platform. Speaking of which, although it may look a bit rough today, seeing the terrain morph the way it does while simultaneously interacting with the water that it holds is still pretty impressive. And the checkerboard pattern was actually a pretty smart move as to avoid the texture smearing that was far too common among N64 games. Finally, while it might seem like an objectively bad choice from a design standpoint, I feel like the inconsistency in the game's fonts really adds to that cobbled together tech demo vibe that got me interested in Wetrix to begin with. You've got some really clean fonts that have aged quite well, and then some stuff that looks straight out of Banjo-Kazooie. Flipping over from minimalism to sensory overload, Tetrisphere caught my eye with its, well, sphere. I can absolutely excuse the game's subpar performance, since this is some of the closest I've seen the N64 get to an actual spherical looking object that isn't a front-facing 2D sprite. Speaking of spheres, look at this little guy. Maybe I'm being generous, but that looks like an early GameCube model. And keep in mind, Tetrisphere is the oldest of the Tree games, released just a year after Mario 64. As for the art direction, it's extremely dark, yet not brooding or abrasive in any way, and the backgrounds, while stereotypically trippy, have this sort of traveling through a vortex sort of quality to them. If you'll allow me to sort of go off for a bit, the most emotionally accurate way I can describe Tetrisphere's visual impression, coupled with the sound design, which I will get to, is as follows. When you play this game, preferably in a dark room with headphones on, you feel like the world itself has ceased to exist and all that's left is you in this sphere, which I guess is symbolic of the last piece of matter left in the universe or something. Some real sci-fi shit, which I'm sure was not H2O's intent, but that's just how my weird brain interprets it. Being the simplest game here, the new Tetris presentation doesn't exactly send me into an existential crisis like Tetrisphere does, but there's still a lot here that I like. On the gameplay side, I adore how the Tetrominos look in this game. The way they're clearly 2D sprites, yet have this nice shading to them, the way they merge together when they land, and I especially love that noisy animated texture that gets applied to any silver or gold blocks you create. The game's strongest visual asset, if you ask me, is its theming and backgrounds. For one, the backgrounds themselves are just pure late 90s CG and Photoshop collage bliss. My favorite being the Egyptian one with its warm color palette and animated fire and glow effects. But it's not the backgrounds themselves that create the new Tetris' visual identity, but rather its wonders of the world theme. I don't know what it is, but whenever a certain franchise utilizes famous landmarks or iconic imagery across the globe and time, it gives it this feeling of the final frontier, as in there's nowhere else left to go from here. When I look at these backgrounds and what they convey alongside the game's title, it creates this image in my head of the ultimate Tetris, but actually good. Hell, a lot of the modernized takes on Tetris out there, like Tetris Worlds for example, almost feel like the ultimate video game as a whole, since there's just something about Tetris that feels so definitive to me. As in, regardless of personal preference, this is the peak of video gaming as a medium. And this is coming from someone with little to no interest in puzzle games, no less. I don't really know what I'm ultimately going on about, but these are just the words that pop into my head anytime I think about this game. It's really bizarre, but hey, that's what this video is about. Trying to convey the vibes that these games emanate through their presentation. Everything I just said goes doubly so for each of the Tree game's soundscapes. I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking that a game's sound design and score make up at least 75% of its atmosphere and sense of presence. Let's pick it back up with Wetrix. While the overall production value on the audio front doesn't quite stack up to H2O's efforts, there's still plenty here to create this surreal late 90s quasi-futuristic sonic picture. The exaggerated water droplet sounds, the little arpeggio every time you evaporate some water, and my absolute favorite, that synthetic voice you hear in the menus and whenever you patch up a hole in the ground. All of this is tied together by some peak drum and bass that's quite a bit slower than what you'd expect from the genre, but it fits the gameplay perfectly despite the limited track selection. I particularly love the classic mode theme with those bouncy synths and synthetic string sections, and especially that flanged high-pass drum loop that occasionally kicks in. The new Tetris goes for a more minimalistic, and how do I put it, literal approach to its sound design. By that, I mean that the Tetraminos actually sound like they're made out of some sort of rock or other such real-world material. There's not much in the way of life-questioning aesthetic appeal here, but the sounds serve their purpose. Placing blocks has some nice impact to it, and clearing lines has this gravelly sort of quality which makes for some great game feel. As with Wetrix, the soundtrack is another flavor of drum and bass, though a bit faster and with far more instrumental variety. Some tracks have your typical synthesized sound, but tying in with the visual theme, there's also an emphasis on more culturally appropriate sounds, acoustic guitars, sitars, chants, and wind instruments. Yeah, Tetrisphere opens up with a jump scare, and, you know, that really sets the tone as far as the sound design is concerned. This game should have been the one to be called Terror Instinct, because every single sound effect would fit right into a horror game. The pieces have this really meaty and bulky sound to them whenever they're destroyed. Even just moving them around sounds like you're moving tectonic plates. And don't even get me started on the goddamn misplaced piece sound. I swear that gets me every single time. The camera suddenly zooming out doesn't help either. Not even the music is safe from this. While there's a fair share of trancey and quite frankly gorgeous tracks here, there's also a lot of stuff in minor and Phrygian dominant like the opening track that jump scares you upon booting up. Also, is it just me or does Azul Lu, I don't know how to pronounce it, use a melodic rhythm that sounds eerily similar to the vocal pattern in Mudvayne's Dig?
Let me have you done forever, I don't care. Let me have you stop your way off the list. Let me have you hold the clock against your head. Let me have you take the shot to your head.
On the prettier side though, songs like Zip Zap, Learn, and Hallucid are just pure zen, and when they kick in and you're just getting matches at light speed, it really does capture that sensation that I described earlier, of being at the center of the universe where time doesn't exist and space is everything in front of you. Before I wrap this video up, there's just one more thing that each of these games do, just by their mere existence, that absolutely fascinates me. I'm sure you're well aware that every single piece of media, regardless of how well it's aged, is still inadvertently dated in one way or another. For example, even with the most timeless of music, there are subtleties in its composition or production that give away the time period that it belongs to. Obviously, the same goes for video games, and that leads me to the point I want to make with this section of the video. All three of these games are incredibly dated. That doesn't mean they don't play well or are badly designed. Rather, everything surrounding the gameplay is a product of a different time, from the late 90s drum and bass soundtracks to the very fact that the new Tetris is called, well, the new Tetris. Think about it. There was a point in human history when Wetrix was one of the latest takes on the Tetris-inspired puzzle game formula, and it was successful enough to receive a Game Boy Color and Dreamcast port, along with a full-on sequel on PS2. As of late, the most experimental the Tetris formula has gotten has been with 99 and Tetris Effect, which are neat, but are still at their core the same game since 85. I must reiterate that I'm not trying to be some new games bad type boomer, but rather I worked on this project to express how these games made me feel about an era I missed out on. Again, imagine being a kid in 97, booting up the Nintendo machine and getting an earful of digitized samples and distorted bass in a brand new puzzle game. Games like this bring to mind imagery of a long gone time of fashion, music, a different world, you know? When Tetrisphere came out, My Own Summer was a contemporary metal song, and Metallica were still working with Bob Rock and had a good sounding snare drum. I guess what I've been trying to say with this video is that it's okay for things to feel dated. I find that people often act as if everything needs to have a timeless, universal appeal to be any good, and while there is genuine value to media that isn't bound too firmly by the sensibilities of its own time, that doesn't mean that everything else is impossible to go back to. Be it nostalgia or curiosity and fascination for a different time, there's always value to something if it's well executed, even in spite of some stylistic choices that would be different today. Case in point, the Black Box Need for Speeds are as dated as can be, with their tuner culture, new metal, cars that are no longer on the market, Lost Prophets being on the soundtrack soundtrack of Underground 1, and so on, but people still love and discuss these games to this very day. That's exactly how I feel about the tree takes on Tetris that I spent 7 pages talking about. They are extraordinarily dated, but that makes them all the more appealing. Thanks for listening to me ramble about N64 games for 15 minutes. See you in whatever I upload next.